Morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual seminar, Regulation or Markets, Unpacking the Sources of Transformative Change for Climate and Biodiversity Governance. This session is jointly organized by the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions and the Asia-Pacific Center for Environmental Law. I'm Jolene Lin, the host for today's seminar and a core researcher at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I'm also the director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law and an associate professor at the NUS Faculty of Law. It's my pleasure to host and speak at today's virtual seminar. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to kindly keep your microphones muted. Please note that this session is recorded and will be posted on YouTube later. Right, to officially begin, thank you for joining us today for the first seminar of 2021. The theme for today is climate and forest governance, with a particular emphasis on litigation and finance or market mechanisms. Ever since the 1992 Rio Summit, domestic and international policy mixes to conserve nature have expanded from traditional regulatory approaches to climate litigation by civil society and as well as finance and market-driven incentives. Are these efforts able to spark the type of transformative change required to address global climate change and mass species extinction? To address this question, we also have with us Professor Benjamin William Kishore, who is a professor in public management at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, as well as the co-director of the Institute of Water Policy. Professor Kishore and I will each begin with a short presentation before we proceed to have a discussion with some audience during the last 20 minutes of the seminar. Without further ado, I'll begin my presentation on strategic climate litigation as a governance tool. So, all right, I can. All right, so I'm just for the first time using a control function, a remote control function. So there's a bit of a time lag, but I'll try my best. All right, so I'm going to begin my presentation. And the title of the presentation is How We Can View Climate Litigation as a Governance Tool. Now, first of all, in terms of the emergence of climate litigation, climate litigation has been around for the last 2 decades. 5-6 years that it has really captured public attention as well as become far more widespread. Today we have climate litigation in about 28 countries plus the EU across all geographical regions. More than 1,000 cases filed in the US and over 300 filed in other jurisdictions. So in the case of climate litigation, the US as well as Australia are considered the mega jurisdictions where a high number of cases have been filed. All right, so here I set out a number of headlines for which refer to climate litigation happening around the world that involve climate litigation. So, for example, oil majors, the idea that you have many of the cases in recent times have basically tried to focus on another be the carbon majors case. Carbon majors accused of rights violation in the Philippines for raw. This referring to, sorry, what's going on? It's referring to a major inquiry by the Philippines Human Rights Commission, which is effectively the only regional human rights body that has pronounced on the climate change responsibilities of corporates when they operate in an overseas jurisdiction. And of course, the last one is referring to Vanuatu, Vanuatu being one of the islands in the Pacific, which is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and has been exploring the potential to use litigation to get compensation to pay for adaptation costs. So this slide basically just shows number of climate cases. And when we talk about climate litigation, and the term strategic climate litigation has only just kind of entered the, maybe in the last 1 or 2 years, entered common usage. Never really acknowledged that litigation was being used as a strategic tool to advance climate policy objectives. The vast majority of cases are against governments, whether they are local governments, state governments, or national governments, as well as corporate actors, particularly major corporations in highly greenhouse gas intensive industries like oil and gas. Here, just a flavor of the number of cases we have seen. Definitely in a growth in the in climate litigation. Now, when we talk about climate litigation, we are really interested in looking at how, as we've mentioned before, the idea that, the idea that a climate litigation can play a governance role, a regulatory role, because climate litigation has been used to try to put pressure or to more ambitious climate change laws and policies. When we look at litigation, we can look at both the direct effects and the indirect effects. The direct effects basically will be looking at the kind of regulatory change or reversal of regulatory developments, while indirect mobilizing public sentiment and keeping climate change on the political agenda. So a very good example of this is one of the cases that I will briefly speak about, Hinder in the Netherlands, where this case, which was heard by the Supreme Court in the Netherlands, was really critical in jump-starting a national dialogue about the role of government in addressing climate change and how much citizens are willing to pay in order for the government to do the right thing, inverted commas, when it comes to climate change. We also see litigation as an opportunity to create leverage to supplement other non-litigation strategies. For example, public campaigns which put the spotlight on the activities of, say, for example, oil and gas companies and how and their contribution to climate change. Some common approaches take litigation. I'm not going to go through all of them, just mention a few. So one of the most common approaches would be challenging local planning decisions. So many planning decisions really do affect where people live and the conditions in which people live. So some of the earliest climate cases involve challenge to local authorities and drought when approving planning applications. Another really route is true environmental EIA. Now, many of the cases are basically premised on the allegation that the government or the regulatory authority has failed to take climate change impacts into account when approving EIA applications. And as a result, the decision is illegal and therefore has to be remanded for further action. And this has been quite a well-established pathway, both in developing and developed countries. And the last thing I would briefly mention is the rise of rights-based litigation. So the idea of litigation being premised on that. The allegation is that the government address climate change is infringing upon the citizens' right to life, which in some constitutions include the right to live in a clean environment. Well, here I'm going to give a brief overview of some cases. I begin with the case of Ahender and the Netherlands. Now, Ahender in the Netherlands was it's truly one of the most transformative cases in the litigation docket, because it is one of the clearest pronouncements by a court about a state's obligations to address climate change. I'm going to discuss the Supreme Court's decision, although a full discussion this will not do a full justice to complexity of the decision and the depth of the reasoning to boisterous. So the Ahender is the first case where we have seen a grounding of the obligation of a state in the European Convention of Human Rights. And basically the court held that the Article 2 required states to take positive action to safeguard the lives of those within its jurisdictions. And this applied to climate change. And Article 8, which is about the right to respect for private reasonable measures to protect individuals against dangerous climate change. Here we mentioned Article 13. Article 13 was relied upon by the court to justify its intervention in what is seen as a policy space. So basically, for lawyers and for constitutional lawyers and scholars, the whole idea that a court could tell a government what to do possibly infringes upon separation of powers. And this was a controversial element of the whole debate in the Netherlands. And the court in this case held that it is not trying to usurp the powers of the executive or the legislature. In fact, it is constitutionally required by Article 13 of the European Convention of Human Rights to offer an effective legal remedy. And if it chooses not to make a decision, derelict in its performance of its judicial duty. And a Supreme Court that held that basically Article 2 and 8 require the state to do its part to prevent dangerous climate change, even if it is a global problem. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about arguments were raised by the government. But I think it's important, what is a highlight of this decision is that the court pronounced, what does it mean for a state to do its part? And it basically held that a state must do what is necessary to achieve scientifically advised targets. And that, and I quote here from the judgment, climate change is a global problem. The fact that it is a global problem does not release the state from its obligations to take measures in its territory within its capabilities, which in concert with the efforts of other states provide protection from the hazards of dangerous climate change. I'm going to briefly talk about Lahari in the interest of time. Basically, the reason why I want to bring attention to Lahari is because it's a case because there has always been a focus on litigation in the global north. And there is this assumption that litigation is a luxury that cannot be afforded by those in developing countries. And my research establishes that it is not true. There are many cases that are being heard by courts in developing countries, including Pakistan, and many of these judgments have the potential for far more ambitious and transformative change than the judgments being advanced in the global north. So Lahari basically is a good example of how a court basically ambitiously tries to advance implementation of climate policy in a developing country. In this case, Lahari is a Pakistani farmer who basically brought it challenging the laws. Now, take a look at the screen and have a sense of how ambitious or how aggressive, in a way, if you would put it in another way, the third was implementing measures and to supervise the government implementing its policy laws. So for an expert climate change commission to assist the court in monitoring the government's progress in implementing the national climate change policies. Now, I'm just going to briefly mention the case of Kim Eugene. Kim Eugene was a constitutional case filed on 13 March 2020. And the reason I mention it is because it's one of those, it is Asia's version of Ahenda. If it's successful, it would put, it provides a very interesting template for, for litigation across many Asian jurisdictions. And also it took place, the case was filed in the midst of a national lockdown. So for those of us who are interested in looking at how strategies are being deployed during the lockdown to advance climate litigation, this was a very interesting case. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I just wanted to Kim Eugene is a youth plaintiff. She and a number of others, they filed a group action, and South Korea's greenhouse gas reduction target was unconstitutional, and that the government was violating its constitutional duty of protection. And as a result, the remedy that they were seeking was for the government to increase its climate ambition. All right, with that, I will end this presentation, and I look forward to taking questions and I apologize once again for the technical issues. Thank you. Over to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. Really found that really interesting and an important contextual presentation for what I want to talk about. And I just wanted to put some context into my talk. As a political scientist who works on policy development, I think about both traditional regulatory approaches to addressing our environmental challenges, but also the potential of these innovative policy options, including finance and market-driven interventions. And I'm increasingly focusing on the most appropriate policy mix of public and private interventions for addressing these crises that we're facing. So if we can, I can move my own cursor now, right? Yeah, oh, nice, this is awesome. So I thought I'd begin with two arguments first. And just say, all of us who work on the environment space, especially the climate crisis and the biodiversity challenges denoted by the fact that we're living in the midst of the 6th great extinction of the planet. Most of us who work in that space think about the practical implications of our scholarship for addressing these issues. And this requires, I think, then two things that are really important for us as applied scholars in some way. The first is to be very clear as to what kind of transformative change we're envisioning when we think about the implications of our research for strategy and practice. What is the transformation that we have in our cognitive frames is one point. And then the other is to then think about, based on that, what are the policies, the institutions, and even the strategies, as Linda just identified, for activists that might actually help trigger this vision of transformative change. So these kind of, I think, two issues are really related to each other. What is the transformation we seek, and what are the implications for policy triggering as a result? And I want to say in the first task, there actually is no consensus among scholars. There's at least 3, if not more, ways to think about transformation. And one has to do with sort of emphasizing the long-term economic sustainability of resource use that can benefit humans, which tends to be questions of how you sustain renewable resources, be they fish, our forests, and so on, to the benefit of humans that are deemed to be sustainable in the long run for our collective well-being. A second consensus, or the second transformational approach is around developing these processes of stakeholder engagement around these questions of environment and sustainability that promote trust, legitimacy, and they build compromises over these problems. And here the transformational aspect is how do we transform engagement of society and governments around problems. But it's the actual process that's the real focus, not the actual outcomes per se. And the third is the actual emphasis on the environmental degradation that human beings are causing on the environment. And these are all really important, but they're different. And the conclusions for the role of policy triggering are different also. That's the first chapter. I just think we always need to think about this in mind when making our statements about what our research means for transformational change. That often is dependent upon the kind of change we seek. So of course, you know, the climate crisis, we're getting warmer faster. Every year, it's the latest warmest year in record, right? We know this is happening. We know that human beings are causing this in part because CO2 emissions stay in the atmosphere for over 300 years. And so we keep on adding to the warming of the planet. We know that the pervasive impacts are multitude, from icebergs crashing to forest fires from Brazil to Australia to the bleaching of the coral reefs. Climate change is a massively widespread challenge that human beings are causing. Okay? Human beings are doing this. And we know that they're related also to the this mass species extinction crisis that I talked about before. The United Nations has actually developed teams of scientists that have once again talked about how we have this extinction crisis alongside the climate crisis, and that they're related to each other. Deforestation, for example, both causes extinctions, but also releases carbon into the atmosphere as well. And I just give this example of the 2 of the million species that are threatened with endangerment right now if we don't change our practices. And we're spending a lot of time bringing market mechanisms and tools to these issues, but we're still seeing tropical forest lost at a large rate despite all these interventions of the last 20 years. And so for me then, the second task is interesting because once we get our problem definition in mind, and let's take, for example, this last one I just reviewed, the actual environmental impacts of human behavior, we have a number of challenges. And that is that one, whatever we do on the policy world almost always triggers multiple steps, not just a single impact. And these steps are complicated. The trigger can be a micro or macro level policy choice. They can actually shape coalition building between, for example, businesses who want to do the right thing and environmental activists, and they can trigger norm change in society as a whole as well. And so each step has different logics for what we can do in our policy mixes and our addressing of these problems. And what's I think even more interesting about this pondering the future is that oftentimes the impacts of our policy choices occur 10, 15 years later. And so it's very difficult to rely on a data-driven, evidence-based approach only for designing a future with different data and different evidence, right? So this requires not just doing a data analysis, but also deliberative thinking about innovative policy options. So I want to now zero in on one mechanism in our broader thinking about these transformational changes that is called the California effect that political scientist Vogel coined a number of years ago. And he noted a really fascinating phenomenon. And that was that it wasn't just that companies were seeking the least costly options to go and invest in the world, but were sometimes actually advocating for higher standards in environmental and social practices. And he noticed that these companies that were seeking higher standards were actually often joining coalitions with environmental groups like the Worldwide Fund for Nature, for example, to advocate for increasing rules. And he was very curious as to why companies would do this. And what he noted is that one reason for this is that companies who were conducting their businesses in relatively highly regulated domestic policymaking arenas. Okay, so the public policy regulations were quite strong on the environment, felt that it wasn't fair, that they should have to be burdened with these rules when their competitors elsewhere did not. And so while the companies initially fought the development of these domestic regulations, once they were in place, the second best option was to increase the regulations elsewhere in the world. And how do you do that? By joining with the NGOs to try and champion politically increased regulations elsewhere. And he found, Vogel, that this was prominent in the United States through California, because California loves rules, loves policies and litigation. And so they were the place where a lot of companies then saw the need to expand California rules elsewhere, both in the US broadly, but also globally through international trading agreements. And Vogel writes a book called Trading Up, in which he found that actually international agreements often embedded environmental rules as a way to create a level playing field for companies in the global economy. And so you got this interesting ratcheting up of environmental standards alongside economic integration, which is not what many scholars had initially expected. They thought you'd see a race to the bottom, okay? But you saw a race to the top instead when the California effect was in place. Okay, so if this effect is actually accurate, it poses really interesting design implications for those thinking about transformational change on the environment. And the first is that the California effect is almost always triggered by a traditional regulatory approach, good old days of government regulating companies to minimize their effects on the environment, okay? The conundrum, though, is that regulatory approaches today are increasingly uncommon in today's sort of focus on market-driven and finance tools, these sort of win-win tools out there that don't think about this first step of the role of regulations as the spark, right? And we end up losing sight of the initial trigger. And this is, I think, and I would argue, problematic for nature-based solutions. Let me give you one example then. I want to turn to the case that I work a lot on eco-labeling. That's this effort to turn away from governments to instead have consumers and customers demand that the products they purchase come from environmentally sustainable sources, okay? And you therefore do this by giving companies who are eco-friendly a label that they can use to sell their products in the marketplace. And this idea has proliferated over the last 25 years to govern almost every critical environmental challenge, from deforestation to commodity practices that are sustainable to, of course, the climate crisis. This is a major tool, a market-based tool to provide economic benefits to those companies doing the right thing, okay? Now, in the case where I work a lot on in the forest sector, a fascinating phenomenon occurred 20 years after the creation of the world's leading eco-labeling organization in forest, known as the Forest Stewardship Council. And that is that 20 years later, support for certification diverged quite a bit among those companies operating in developed countries and emerging markets and developing markets. And the overall story here in this graph, I haven't got time to go into the details, but the overall story here is that the companies that supported eco-labeling programs initially were those that were operating under very strict public policies. And they realized that by adopting certification, they did not have to change their practices very much at all, okay? So in other words, they were actually supporting certification owing to the California effect. They saw a benefit, a market benefit in getting and supporting a market-driven eco-labeling program as a way to get some advantage for these tough rules they were under vis-a-vis their competitors, right? But in places where the competitors didn't have strong rules or didn't have rules that were enforced, there wasn't as much support for certification, right? As you would expect, based on this idea of triggering and what's the reason for support in the first place. So the public policy foundations of why firms support eco-labeling programs has gone underexplored, even though it's really key for thinking about these pathways that we might follow. So if the explanation for so much private governance eco-labeling support in the North was owing to domestic regulations, and we think that there's a lot of support for that, then we have to think about what this means for the scientific project of our research. And the first is that impact evaluations on the companies who support certification systems, like before and after evaluations of their changes, transformative changes of individual behavior, are misplaced. Because you would not expect much transformational change from those companies that supported these programs as a way of getting recognition for what they're doing in the marketplace versus changing their own practices. The transformational impact would be on companies that had yet to join and have these standards, but would do so when the market deemed it to be so, right? And that means building market support for these systems to encourage those other companies to come up to those public policy standards through private governance. Okay, so the private governance provides the second and third step to this transformational change project, but the first step was ironically public policies. Okay, so the trick then is how to think about then fostering market incentives among customers to have these firms in less regulated areas ratchet up through the California effect using a mix of public and then private governance interactions as a way to do this. So that's the trick. That's not easy, but to me, that's where we want to devote a lot of our attention. But it means avoiding the Delaware effect, okay? And this is the opposite phenomenon, where firms actually are attracted to places with the fewest environmental regulations. This is the traditional race to the bottom that people expect of economic globalization, right? The race to the bottom. So how do we therefore avoid the Delaware effect while nurturing this pathway towards the California effect through public-private policy interactions? It's a complex story for sure. And I spent the last 15 years thinking of these questions deeply. But when we stand back, the big picture is sobering. It's a sobering big picture. Okay, now this is just an example of some data we collected for support for 3 leading certification programs in Brazil, Cote d'Ivoire, and Indonesia, which shows that over time, support for certification now in the tropics, not just in the developed world, is increasing dramatically. Okay, this support's increasing. This is what this graph says overall. However, at the same time, deforestation continues in each of these cases where certification took hold. Deforestation increased. It kept on increasing. It did not stop or decrease. It did not. I mean, there are some cases where the relative changes were smaller, but deforestation continued its march. So it's a sobering lack of a correlation between deforestation and support for certification. This is problematic because scientists are now worried that we only have around 10 to 12 years left to reduce the major effects of climate change from both deforestation and regular industrial emission sources. We've had 20 years, 25 years of these systems in place trying to ratchet up, but we're not getting there when it comes to this transformational change we need to do when it comes to environmental problems. And now we're being told time's getting very short indeed. So what are the lessons then for transformational change? I would say 1, policy mixes are indeed capable of producing transformative change, but it requires much more innovation and design, integrating the complex pathways we expect to see and in ways that reinforce, not detract from, the actual environmental problems we're trying to transform themselves. And this means avoiding designs that are more likely to produce the Delaware effect than the California effect. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that really interesting presentation. We'll now be opening the floor for questions. You may submit your questions via the chat function and via pollev.com. And you can even upvote other questions that you find interesting as well. The link is currently on the chat. So the first question we have, okay, sorry. All right, we have 2 questions here. All right, Okay. Ben, would you like to take a question? Would you like to choose a question first before I and then I'll take the second one.
Okay, sure. I see two on my screen. Is that right, or are there more? Or do I?
Scroll down.
Let's go down.
Yeah, I only see two.
Okay, yeah. Okay, let's do the. Oh, yeah, those are litigation questions. You got a lot of litigation questions. Maybe we'll go to the top one on sanctions against companies.
All right.
Yeah, because that's an interesting question, actually. Sanctioning companies versus rewarding them with economic incentives. And this is the big debate between, do we use carrots or do we use sticks when it comes to thinking about company behavior? And what I would say is that these debates around sticks and carrots tend to be kind of like bifurcated, when actually, again, going back to my presentation, it's the policy mix in question that's actually really important. How do we think about using regulations as creating this, very important message to companies about what they have to do, but also finding some ways to think about how they can draw on their own objective functions, their material interests, to actually foster a global race to the top. And that means thinking about sanctions in the context of these global supply chains that companies are involved in. How do you think about creating incentives and disincentives for that lead to these pathways versus more of A causes B kind of approach?
Thanks, Ben. Zhang Jie, I'm happy to answer any of the questions on climate litigation. If you could just flash one and I will come to it. Thank you. Okay, sure. Let's go for that. Thank you. All right, so will climate litigation continue to feature as a transformative tool amidst the COVID pandemic or in a post-COVID world as countries commit to green recovery and building back better? So that's a great question, because I think the underlying assumption is that all countries in the world are committed to green recovery. And we don't really see that much empirical evidence of that. There are many countries, led primarily by the EU, which have been talking about the importance of a green recovery. But that has been still at the policy planning stage. We haven't seen real action on that. Plus, behind the scenes, we do see a lot of regulatory rollback. A number of civil society actors and as well as research centers have already launched massive research initiatives to study the rollback of environmental laws and policies in many countries by governments under the pretext of COVID. A good example would be, for example, in India, where the Modi administration last year basically reduced the stringency of environmental impact assessment rules to provide some support for the economy during the lockdown. So I think climate litigation it's not I think, but climate litigation continues to feature as an important tool. I'm involved in a number of coalitions that have been sending letters, official letters to governments to indicate that we are watching the space, and litigation will be used to enhance the accountability and transparency of how governments are fulfilling their climate obligations in the post-COVID world.
Let me just add to that too. In one of my cases, we find that there's an interesting initial policy mix when governments develop environmental regulations, especially governing resource use, but also climate change, where they allow for the right of environmental groups to actually litigate against government agencies who are not following the regulations. So it's a built-in mechanism to encourage society to mobilize around what the policy requires if companies are avoiding that. And this particular mechanism does explain in part transformational changes in Oregon and even Washington State and California when it came to protecting species extinctions and old growth forests that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And that in turn explains then why these companies operating there sought private governance to get rewards for these outcomes. But the litigation mechanism reinforced the initial policy trigger. It's really important for the story.
Oh, that's true. And I think that's how that also kind of ties back to one of the themes of our seminar, which is how litigation and other regulatory mechanisms are like working together, but it's sometimes not working well together.
Yeah.
Yeah, 这样子, would you like to hide this question? And oh wow, next question for Ben, please. Prof. Ben, how can we? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I love that question. And I wish we had a whole time for a seminar. I've got a few minutes, so this is a really important question we spent a lot of time on in my lab, because if I'm right, and the actual effects of the transformational change are not with the companies that initially supported certification because their policy requirements required it, but because they wanted to get economic benefits, and the actual effects are on companies that have yet to join, then how do you measure that empirically? You can't, actually. It's going to happen in the future, which means you need to redesign well and have these projected, what we call plausible logics for how these companies might be enticed to therefore ratchet up. What we found, though, in the eco-labeling sector was that a lot of companies involved didn't have the transformational change in mind when thinking about the environment, but rather around the compromise effects. So we did studies on the content of the desired environmental regulations governing certification programs. And we did a recent study that actually showed that companies were more likely to support regulations that were, by being compliance, were all ready to improve their bottom line economically, like reforestation requirements and so on. Whereas the tough rules, like no logging in special water zones in forests that would cost companies money, companies were less likely to support these regulations. So we think bringing effectiveness questions into the study of regulations themselves, the private regulations, and then expectations for support in the future are one way to think about effectiveness of voluntary standards. But most research looks backwards. Did it change the company's behavior? And that's a very poor way to think about these pathways, complex pathways that might lead to change in the future. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing limited effectiveness now of these programs on the ground, despite the fact they still could have potential to be part of a really important policy mix around sustainable change.
Thanks, Ben. Effectiveness is always like the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to take the another question. I guess this question works for what are the cross-cutting ethical I'm happy to take one of the climate litigation questions, and then Ben and I can answer one of these questions. What about this one? How successful would? Okay, can we have a look at this question? How different would successful? Yeah. How different in developed versus developing countries in terms of what is needed to affect behavioral change? All right. Okay, I guess if I could just rephrase the question a little bit. I guess the question is asking whether the person is asking whether would you have different policy mixes in developed versus developing countries in order to increase or enhance their success? And and obviously the ultimate goal of these regulatory policy mixes would be to change behavior. Ben, would you like to take a shot first before I go ahead?
Sure. Of course, the answer is yes. They're very different. Everything's going to be context specific and how you think about these baskets. One example is I work on the issue of illegal logging, which is not meant to actually reward the best practices, but to weed out the worst practices. And there we find that there's a lot more interest in the part of developing countries to be engaged in this initiative. Because oftentimes the illegal producers aren't paying fair wages, they're ignoring even baseline government rules. And so the coalition of interests seeking to weed out the worst is much stronger and higher than the coalition for the high standard programs. And therefore it might be that in terms of your steps, you begin with, in the developing world, more of these illegality mechanisms that then might help trigger broader change at the higher level later.
Yeah.
Short answer to a very important long question.
And I'll echo what Ben says, and I'll draw a little bit on the research I've been doing on climate litigation in developing countries versus developed countries. So in general, when we look at environmental law, we have different categories of regulatory policies. So you have command and control, which is the traditional regulatory approach. You have market-based. You also have self-regulation, etc. Now, by and large, in general, developing countries, I think that the general consensus is that traditional regulation is still essential as the dominant framework, and therefore deploying the resources of public prosecutors, etc. What we find is that if we also have to take into consideration that very different socioeconomic and political conditions exist in developed countries versus developing countries. So for example, in the case of climate litigation, it's really, really challenging to bring climate lawsuits in the developing countries because of existing underlying conditions like judicial corruption, the fact that environmental defenders do face life-threatening situations, and not just them, but their families as well. And also that enforcement of judgments is usually a very significant issue. You may have a far-reaching transformative judgment by an enlightened judge, but it is not enforced, and that's a real problem as to the value of this of litigation as a pathway for regulation. So yeah, definitely, there's going to be these are some of the issues we come across. Yeah.
Maybe I can come to the question on the ethical question.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I think there's it's a fundamentally important question that goes to my original first PowerPoint slide, which is that, of course, in the developing world, you have two ethical obligations, really, that are coalescing a lot of groups. One is the need for development to address poverty alleviation, and especially around disempowered communities and indigenous communities, and that's a critically important challenge. And the other is environmental degradation that human beings are causing on the environment, that's causing so much of the species extinction crises. We tend not to have the conversation about which one of these should be the priority, right? We tend to say they're both important, but that leads to policy designs that actually can undermine species extinctions. And so having this conversation, which is not something that an academic can impose, hey, the answer is it's more ethical to do X. No, but rather, once you decide what you want to do, what is your ethical obligation that's giving the most important attention, then we can help with what we call fit for purpose policy design. But right now what's happening is our policy designs are making these choices for us, and they're not choosing the environment. And so I say, let's be proactive on what are the ethical obligations that inform our problem definitions and not back into it accidentally.
Thanks, Ben. It's very true. All right. What do you want to answer? Shall we answer this question? What kind of research is most useful for climate activists? What kind of questions need to be answered in order to effectively inform biodiversity governance? So I'll just briefly answer this, and at least from the climate litigation perspective, the scientific evidence is really important as a sound basis for any legal arguments. So the kind of research that has been really valuable for climate activists has been on the climate science, proving or at least establishing causation between emissions and effects and impacts. That has been very important. And I think that points to the importance of having these conversations, right, when we are trying to learn from each other about the advancement in climate science and its solutions. Ben, is there any?
Yeah, I would add to that too. I find it quite fascinating that climate activists, I think, on the side of illuminating the science, have been excellent in the world as an important source of knowledge generation. However, on the policy tool side, I'm not so sure. It seems to me that oftentimes the tools they choose don't have these plausible logics for transformational change, but rather they serve to coalesce the movement itself. And so the movement becomes the actual problem definition, not the actual impact. For example, a lot of work now being done on divestiture campaigns where universities and other corporations are targeted to stop investing in fossil fuel industries. Now that does have some kind of an effect because you do change who owns what stocks, but without strong environmental regulations at global and domestic levels, it's hard to see how that's just going to shift who happens to be the stock owners versus the problems themselves. And so it's actually possible that these movements are reinforcing this problem of a disconnect between the policy tools we choose, in this case, the finance mechanism on investment, rather than the problems we're trying to solve. And it's just such a complex question that requires the minds of all of us to think innovatively around these pathways, that even the movements, I think, sometimes fall short. That's controversial, I know, but I think it's probably true. We have to think more rigorously about these pathways and the cause and effect implications of what we're championing to address the climate crisis.
Thank you, Ben. Ben, I think we have time for one question each. So I'm going to ask Zhang to scroll, and you pick one and I'll pick one.
Sure.
All right, sounds good. Okay, I'll take a breakdown of questions, of cases. Yeah, perfect. So the question is whether there's a breakdown of what type of cases have been litigated and what is the expertise of the regulators and courts in the different areas. Yes, there is a breakdown. There are two major databases in the world on climate litigation. One is out of the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, and the other one is the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at the London School of Economics. A number of us are also working with the Grantham Institute to establish a third database, which I guess I can plug it. We will launch at the end of the year at the COP in Glasgow, hopefully. So the breakdown of the type of cases, the vast majority of cases in climate litigation today are really challenging the government's targets and government's policies. For example, a commitment by the government that the economy will decarbonize by X amount by 2030, and then another X amount by 2050. So these targets that have been announced recently by China, by South Korea, by Japan, are really held up as some indications of what can be litigated. Also, the commitments under the Paris Agreement. There are no cases related to poaching. There are quite a number of cases focused on illegal logging and deforestation. Particularly in the last year, in Brazil, there has been at least 6 major cases filed by public prosecutors and political parties to hold the Bolsonaro administration accountable for its role in increasing deforestation in the Amazon. And it's been a really high profile. These cases have been really high profile because there is a lot of institutional and investor pressure on the kind of troubling trends that we are seeing in the Amazon. The expertise of the regulators and different courts in the different areas, many of these cases come through administrative law because a lot of the cases are basically launched on the basis that individual pieces of legislation, for example, the forestry law, the mining law, have been violated. But of course, we do see that environmental tribunals play an important role in giving quite positive or pro-climate judgments. Yeah, so that I'll leave it at that. And Zhang, maybe over to Ben, please.
Yeah, I'll take the greenwashing question. That was the question on, does the California effect risk greenwashing? I think it's a really important question, and I would answer by saying yes, but more specifically, it could lead to what we call problem conception drift. So, for example, in sustainability studies, there are 2 underlying questions. One is, how do you maintain, for example, in the forest sector, how do you maintain forests in the long run to grow them responsibly, and minimize the impacts on species extinctions, but except we will have some. And the other is to actually conserve the forest from those activities itself, right? Conservation of nature. And those are two different problem conceptions. And it does appear that the California effect has been applied a lot more to the one around sustainable harvesting of resources problem conception. That one that I talked about with the Forest Stewardship Council, which is fine. That's an important source of thinking. But it appears to have come at the expense of transformational change on the conservation of nature side. Less attention to that question. How do we actually just conserve nature because nature deserves to be preserved, which was the original approach in the 1980s, where we just had regulations that said, line on a map, don't go in there. That's nature, right? And now we don't do that anymore. And so I think the California effect attention that I'm part of placing attention on has shifted problem definitions away from the conservation of nature towards the sustainable production of nature. Okay, so that shift happened accidentally. Nobody was like, this is, we want to be evil, but rather it was a problem conception drift. And I would argue, you got to reverse that. We first begin with fundamental questions of nature conservation on its own right. And then we think about after that, how do we do sustainable resource management after that? But we reverse the actual, the tail is wagging the dog now, where we do sustainable resource use, but we don't do the conservation part. And my scholarly community, I think by chasing the California effect, didn't make this distinction, and we're partly to blame for that shift.
Thank you, Ben. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone, for your active participation and your questions. Please feel free to reach out to Ben or myself if we didn't manage to answer your questions due to the time constraint.